So, this first slide basically is we're here today for this portion for the 2021 code change training of the VRC, the Virginia Residential Code. The effective date of that was January of this year, 2024. So it is in effect. But as a VR, an NRS refresher, new residential structure refresher, if you remember that the law or the Code of Virginia allows for a year grace. So we have a year grace for the 2018 edition. Some people may refer to that as the previous edition. So just keep that in mind as we go through this process. That camera is going to keep me tied into one place, isn't it? No, it'll follow me. There's a few slides along the way that I'll point out that when y'all are doing your NRS inspections, you need to know which code is in effect. Because of that grace period, a contractor can request that they use the previous code. And you'll see some of these changes are fairly significant. And so they're probably going to want to use the previous code in those instances so that they don't have to do some of those updated expensive requirements. So the point is that the 2021 edition is in effect, came into effect January 18th of this year, but the law allows a 1-year grace period. So they can still choose and use the 2018 edition up to January 18th of 2025. All right, so here's our agenda. We'll cover the most significant changes in the VRC, and that's only about 115 of 600 total changes. So there's a whole lot of changes, and that has increased over the cycle. And a cycle is three years. And the reason for that is, if you remember from your NRS, is because Virginia will take the 2021 code and go through the same process of that a law has to go through. So that takes about 2.5 years. So that's why in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we're always lagging behind, because the 2024 code for those home rule states, Virginia is a Dillon rule state, which means the state tells us what you can and can't do. Home rule states, they can do whatever they want. The localities in the state can do whatever they want. So most home rule states, they've already adopted and are using the 2024 code. So in Virginia, we're just now getting into the 2021 code, the Virginia Residential Code. And the process is they take the IRC, the International Residential Code, amend it, and then come up with the Virginia Residential Code. And they do that with all the other codes too. The IBC becomes the VCC, the Virginia Construction Code. The IPC, the International Plumbing Code, becomes the VPC, the Virginia Plumbing Code. But in the Commonwealth of Virginia, if you're doing residential construction, then you should be able to build right out of this book. All trades as well. And we'll go through some of the trade changes as well. Here's the type of changes you'll see, and you will see these notations. I think it's in the upper left corner. You'll see those changes in the upper left corner. Obviously, the plus sign is something that's added. The minus sign is deletion. The pencil is a modification, and the magnifying glass, yeah, I should know that because I have a couple of those. The magnifying glass is just a clarification. And the slides, which DHCD or the Code Academy did a pretty good job of leaving some of the code change language in, so I can show you what a code change looks like, but you won't see that language, those notes in the actual book. All right, so if you're in the physical book, then in the margins, these are some of the markings. A double vertical line in the margin means that's a Virginia amendment. A single solid vertical line in the margin indicates that was a technical change of that particular section from the previous edition of the code. An arrow means that that section or something in that section was deleted. An asterisk indicates that a table or text associated to that language has been relocated. And then a double asterisk, that's the first time I've seen that. A double asterisk placed in the margin indicates that the text or table immediately following has been relocated. So that's something new. If you're digital, meaning the online version, then in addition to those markings, you're going to see that Virginia specific amendments are in red type, and any changes from the 2018 International Code that weren't amended by Virginia will be in blue. And then again, deletions are marked with an arrow. All right, a couple definitions that changed. And here's what I was telling you about the language. So when you look at a code change, that's what the language looks like. They will take, generally in today's technological advancements, they will take copy and paste and then go through and underline where they've added new language and then cross out old language. So there's see if I can make this work right. The pencil is a modification of the original definition. And so an emergency escape and rescue opening, or EERO, as it's generally referred to, located such that the bottom of the clear opening is not more than 44 inches above or below the finished ground level adjacent to the opening. In the 2012 code, that measurement was from finished floor to the lowest point of the net clear opening. And a lot of people tended to interpret that as right there, the bottom of the sill, as opposed to the opening. So in 2015 and 2018 editions, the language was changed. And so it created a bit of confusion. So now they've gone back and they've created this language, which they claim is going to clarify so there won't be as much confusion. This is in the definitions. It's not the technical section, but it's a good time to point out that, see where it says less than or equal to 44 inches, less than or equal to 44 inches from the opening or the grade. That's one of the requirements in the technical section about a window opening and what that net opening has to be. For example, if on the first floor, you're less than or equal to 44 inches from that measurement to the ground, then you're allowed to reduce the net opening to 5 square foot. Otherwise, it has to be 5.7 square foot. So when you're going through some of these code sections, be careful about what you're asking. An example would be if John calls me up and says, what does the net square opening of an EERO have to be? I can't give John a general answer. I need to know the specifics. And one of the specifics would be, okay, John, is it first floor? Is it basement? What's the distance from grade to the opening, the clear opening? Then I can answer his question. Because if I just tell him 5.7 square feet, that might be the wrong answer because it didn't take into consideration this. I know that can be confusing, and I don't want to confuse you, but I think it's important to point that out, and that's one of the slides that's good to make sure that that gets brought to your attention. Another definition for townhouse, as you can see, there's some language that's underlined. Previously, a townhouse was defined as a single family dwelling unit and a group of 3 or more dwelling units in one building, and now you can see that it's a building that contains 3 or more attached townhouse uses. So they just kind of flip some language around. What I want to bring to your attention is that in townhouses, we were talking earlier about fire rated construction. In townhouses, this creates a 0 lot line. So that's a 0 lot line. So that has to have a fire rated assembly that separates townhouse 1 from townhouse 2, and the same thing from 2 to 3 and on down the line. That's called a zero lot line. There's another slide coming up that makes a change to the fire rate assembly, and I'll get more into that when we get to that slide. Chapter 3 is all about loads. This is the new section. You can see the plus sign up there, intermodal shipping containers. Up until this code cycle, basically the USBC, which is the administrative document, said that as long as you're using shipping containers as storage, you're not going to change the scope or the purpose. It's exempt from the code. You don't need to do anything. No permits, no inspections, no anything. On the West Coast, they do a lot of this. I guess it's because there's so many intermodal containers out there that are vacant or being sold. So they do a lot of buildings and structures that incorporate shipping containers. So now there's a new section in the code that says that there are provisions for construction with shipping containers by referencing this section here. Nah, that's not what I wanted. By referencing that section there. Here's expanded view of that. Notice that it says that buildings or structures, these shipping containers used as buildings or structures shall be designed in accordance with section 3115 of the IBC, or in this case, it would be the Virginia Construction Code, the VCC, which is the commercial version of the IBC, just like the VRC is a residential version of the IRC. One thing that needs to be noted is that designed by means you have to have an engineer involved. So an engineer, structural engineer, and architect has to design that use or repurposing in accordance with this section. I don't know that you'll see a lot of that in Virginia. Certainly not in this area. It's very costly to do that. Story height. This is clarification. In 2003, 2006 code, the maximum bearing of a wall stud was 10 feet. An exception allowed that to go up to 12 feet when an engineer design for a wall was provided. Now this requirement accepts the fact that stud heights are okay up to 12 feet with a maximum story height of 13 feet 7 inches. Notice the difference in the notation of stud height and story height. I think one reason why that changed was because in a lot of localities, once you accept an engineered design, for example, in Chesterfield County, there's a builder that has a specific retaining wall that is associated to their poured wall for their steps that come up out of the basement. And they started that floor plan several years ago, and each individual project, we requested an engineered report. And then at some point, our director said, well, we know what's in that report. Why can't we just do an inspection based upon what we now know and not require an engineered design? So in that particular case, for that particular builder, that's how we approach that. If you go to the code for that wall, you won't find that specifics of that wall in the code, but because we have previously accepted engineered designs over and over for the exact same process, our director said, well, it seems silly to make them hire a structural engineer to reproduce what we know will work. And I think in some instances in the code, and this may be the case, if the engineers over the years have said, as long as you've got these specific criteria, a 12-foot stud is okay, then that's now adopted into the code. So it's no longer required to be engineered. Here's the table that reflects that change. This is the new change. It's a seismic category that was added. And I think if you look at the map, you'll see that that's kind of the Louisa area. Yeah, Powhatan, Louisa, Goochland, and Cumberland. Y'all remember the earthquake that was in 2010? Epicenter was Louisa, Mineral, Virginia, whatever. Destroyed a lot of homes. So I think that's kind of where this is coming from. Anchorage of water heaters. Notice it says townhouses only. So if you're in that area that's in that circle, Goochland, Powhatan, Cumberland, Louisa, and Hanover, and you have a townhouse, then the water heater has to be anchored. And this is an example of how to accomplish that.
Only in townhouses, huh? That's weird.
I've yet to see that, so maybe they'll talk about the old code. Yeah, well, again, this is 2021, so if they ask for the 2018, they would not have to do this. You might ask, why only townhouses? I don't know. Earthquake doesn't know the difference between a townhouse and a single family dwelling, right? So I don't have access to the code change, the actual code change, because in that they would put a reason statement. So, and I didn't have time to do the research. I apologize for that. But I question why a townhouse, why not a single family dwelling? So again, that's just to reiterate, townhouses only, category C. Why it's not single family homes, I don't know. Chapter 3, life safety. Here's the slide I was referring to earlier about a firewall. So the zero lot line requires a rated assembly to separate townhouse 1 from 2, 3, 4, and so on. In this particular instance, there's a change, and that change is here. So historically, when I think it was 2008, when townhouses were taken out of the commercial code, the IBC, and put into the IRC, it still required the exterior sheathing to be rated. So your firewall had to go all the way out to your exterior sheathing, and then on 4 foot of each side, you had to have fire rated plywood or some sort of fire rated sheathing. Somewhere along the line, that exterior sheathing in the residential code only was taken out. So then you had your firewall just had to extend all the way to the exterior sheathing. So now this is a subsequent change that says, okay, now your rated assembly, which typically is core board, 2 layers of 1-inch core board, doesn't have to go all the way to the exterior, providing you do this 2-inch nominal lumber in that scenario. Here's a significant change. And this might be one of the ones that, as long as they can get away with it, they'll use the previous edition of the code of 2018. The door between the garage and the residence must now be self-closing and self-latching. Currently, under the 2018 code, it just has to be a solid metal door with a minimum 20-minute rating. Well, if you're familiar with fire rated products, not not much of anything is 20-minute, everything's 30-minute or greater, right? So typically the solid steel door that you see in most new construction is a 30-minute door. Now it has to not only be that fire rated door, but it has to be self-closing and self-latching. I know we were talking earlier about on the commercial side that now when you do something like this on the commercial side, all of your hardware, including your closure, would have to be rated as well. In this particular case, you don't. The code is kind of silent on that. So the code heads seem to say, well, since it doesn't tell you, then it's not required. So the door has to be rated, meaning you can't have any glass in it unless it's the wired fire rated glass, no openings. It has to be solid, and now it has to be self-closing and self-latching. And it doesn't give you, I think this is a mistake on their part because it doesn't give you a timing of that self-closing, self-latching. On the commercial side, you can't use that on the residential side, but just as a reference to what I just said, on the commercial side, that door has to close and self-latch within 10 seconds. So this doesn't, there's no requirement, no performance requirement about that door other than it has to be there. It has to meet that self-closing, self-latching. I'm not sure what the purpose of that is. I can imagine that what's going to happen is as soon as the homeowner moves in, they're going to disengage the self-closing, self-latching.
Sorry. You have to hold the button down. So
the hinges come pre-closing, they're spring loaded. So for them to disengage it, they'd have to change the hinges, first of all. And the second thing is so car fumes don't get into the house. That's why they want it self-closing, because some idiot probably left their car running and killed somebody in another
Well,
state or whatever.
there's a slide coming up about another change in a garage, and that may be in line with what you just explained. On the commercial side, they do make a hinge that you can adjust the tension. And inevitably what happened was it's a very fine line between where it needs to be and you've broken the hinge. And so if the doors, because I think 99% of the time, these doors are complete exterior units. You go to the supplier and it comes with, it's already hung, comes with its frame, threshold, weather stripping, the whole 9 yards. So I would imagine that those hinges are probably going to be already there. They're going to have to be adjusted. No?
And the commercial price sealed, and they just close automatically.
sorry. 33 people. Right. But 39. We have 39 people remote.
39 people
We have
remote?
we have 39 people remote. That's why we must use microphones, including me.
All right, moving along. Mechanical ventilation. Whole house mechanical ventilation came in as an option in 2012. And then I think it was 15, it became a requirement. 18, the previous edition, they stepped that up. And the problem they discovered was that if the whole house exhaust is on the other end of the home, then, and you don't have a window, sorry about that. I set my alarm. I don't know what's up with that. If you didn't have an operable window in the kitchen, then you were going to pull that exhaust and that fume from the kitchen all through the house. So the 2021 code says that you have to have a whole house mechanical ventilation system or a mechanical ventilation system capable of producing the required air changes in habitable rooms. So you've got a choice now. You can either do a whole house Or you can, and the way I interpret that is using the kitchen as an example, you still have to do the whole house, but you can put a hood, range hood that will exhaust the kitchen fumes and the cooking odors and whatever, and you'd be okay. Or you could do a ventilation system in each habitable room. Now, who would do that? I don't know, but that option is there.
So Larry, we got a question from the Peanut Gallery. Peter Onsbach he's asking about it. Is this a code? Now, he asked this question when you had the previous slide up about garage doors. He's wanting to know if this is a code only on new construction.
Yes, only on new construction. If you remember in your NRS class, in chapter 1, which is the USBC, the administrative portion, there's a section 102.3, I think, that talks about the scope of the code. And it tells you in a paragraph that this code, meaning in this particular instance, the 2021 code, applies to buildings and structures built now, new construction. Down at the bottom of that paragraph, it goes on to say, and this has always been in the code, even going back to the Cabo days when I first came with the county in the early 90s. There's a paragraph at the end of that that says that, however, if a home or structure was built under a previous addition, then as long as that hasn't been changed, then it only has to meet that requirement that was in effect when that home was originally built. And so if you go back in and you're going to replace like for like, you don't have to meet current code. You only have to meet, which would include maintenance, you only have to meet the code that was in effect when that home was originally built. We get a lot of complaints when it comes to re-roofing, replacing windows, because a lot of the homes 20, 30 years ago didn't require, especially for re-roofing, didn't require drip edge, didn't require the ice and water shield. And so a lot of your contractors now, when they do a re-roof, meaning a tear off, they want to add in all of that. And the insurance companies aren't paying for that because the insurance companies have gotten wind of the fact that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have what we call a no retrofit clause, meaning as long as you're just repairing, maintaining, you're not adding on, you're not completely gutting the home and renovating it, you don't have to ever make it come up to meet current code requirements. You can just put stuff back right like it was. In the case of windows and doors and stuff like that, water heaters, furnaces, you might not be able to find that. You may be forced to do something 90 plus or 95 plus or whatever. But chapter 1. So having said that, long story short, this only applies to new construction. It does not apply for remodel. Now, there is a slide that's going to contradict that, and I'll leave that up to you when we get into the emergency escape and rescue opening stuff. Okay? But the answer to the question is only applies to new construction. All right, this is a requirement that has kind of been monkeyed with and changed. Prior to the 2000 edition of the code, ceiling height had to be 7 feet, but it did allow beams to project 6 inches below that ceiling height, provided they were at least 4 feet apart. Somewhere along the line in 2015, that exception included all areas, basements, finished, unfinished, or whatever. So this requirement changes that to the minimum finish to finish horizontal dimension between the beams is 36 inches. And it notes that this requirement doesn't include basements because that part of the exception in basements didn't change. So it doesn't matter whether it's finished or unfinished. If it's a basement, you can still get by with 6 foot 4 inches, and you can have the projections below that but everywhere else, it has to be 6.6. Now, let's take this a step further and kind of piggyback along what we were just talking about, the no retrofit clause. Let's say a home was originally built and it was an unfinished basement, and now they want to come in and finish it. More than likely, the locality is not going to make them meet this requirement. Regardless, they're probably just going to let them encapsulate whatever's there, ductwork, beams, whatever, and be done with it, even though it's now going to become finished space. I'm not speaking for localities. I'm just saying that that's probably what's going to happen. They're not going to make them tear out the floor system to make something existing comply with the new. This is a change. Emergency escape and rescue opening requirements. So emergency escape and rescue openings are now required to have an unobstructed 36-inch wide path to a public way. This is a significant change to the residential code, and the reason for that is up until now, the code in chapter 1 has only given authority for buildings and structures. So if you're out in the yard, you're outside the code, unless you can determine that it's a building or a structure. A good example of that would be a pool is considered a structure, but a retaining wall for landscaping purposes, as long as it's not supporting the pool or it's not supporting any other structure, is just considered landscaping. So it's out in the yard, it's just landscaping, no permit, nothing required, is exempt. So now we're reaching out beyond buildings and structures, and we're saying that you have to have a 36-inch wide path to the public way. The definition of public way is a street, alley, or other parcel of land open to the outside air, leading to a street that has been deeded, dedicated, or otherwise permanently appropriated to the public for public use. It says, in the notes, it says the code stipulates that the yard is not required to open directly into a public way, provided it opens to an unobstructed path, typically another yard that leads to the public way. So what that tells me is you've got a fence around your house and you're out in your yard, you're not in the public way. You have to get beyond that fence to an area, whether that be wooded or another yard that's open to an alley or street or something that's been deeded, dedicated for public use. I don't know how localities are going to enforce this, because if it gets challenged in court, they haven't changed the language to reflect what it says in chapter 1. Chapter 1 says buildings and structures. It doesn't say public way or anything beyond the house. Same thing for that retrofit clause I talked about a moment ago. Chapter 1, if you remember back to your NRS classes, in the building code, you've got chapter 1, and then you've got chapters 2 through 35. Chapter 1 trumps everything that could be in 2 through 35. So, and this is relevant to when we're going to talk about the window requirement that I think is coming up. If there's something in chapters 2 through 35 that are in conflict with chapter 1, then chapter 1 takes precedence and you can't enforce that. And so that's the argument that we have a lot of times with these roofing contractors, is because it will tell you in chapter 9 roof covering that when you're doing a re-roofing, you're required to ice and water shield if you're in that area, blah, 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 blah. But chapter 1 says, as long as that home has not been changed, meaning you didn't take the existing roof off, put an entirely new roof on, meaning the structural part of it, not just the roof covering, then you only have to go back on that roof with what was originally there. A lot of the roofing contractors want to argue that point. They've challenged that, and both the housing board and the courts have said, no, chapter 1 trumps anything chapters 2 through 35. All right, so this is just some additional language that talks about that emergency escape opening. And now it's under decks, porches, cantilevers, anything that could vertically obstruct. You have to have a path that meets that requirement that's not less than 36 inches in height and not less than 36 inches in width. And so that coincides with this. It says that when you come out of that emergency escape rescue opening, you have to have an unobstructed 36-inch pathway to a public way. So now if you're, and I think there's a slide, yeah. So now if you're in a basement or if you're coming out under a deck or something, then that opening has to meet certain requirements, especially on the width that coincides with that minimum 36-inch wide pathway to the public way.
And explain why they have an escape window in the basement where they normally have a door.
Say that again, please.
So their code is set up so that it's for a window coming out the back of the structure, correct? Out of the basement below ground. But normally in every townhouse I've ever seen, there's a back door in that level, which would be your emergency escape.
All right, so EERO, emergency escape and rescue opening, is not associated to all habitable rooms. It's typically associated to bedrooms, sleeping areas.
Right.
So an EERO can be either a door or a window. So if you have a bedroom in the basement that's open to that door, then you can use that door as your EERO. But if you have a door on that bedroom that separates you from the main area that leads you to that exterior door, now you have to have an EERO in that sleeping room. So EERO, and this is why I kind of mentioned the example about if John calls me up and wants to know what the requirement of an EERO is, I need to know more. I can't just generally ask his question. So EERO is specifically designed for sleeping areas and such. It's not just any room in the house or basement. Okay. All right, so this is talking about area wells of, again, EERO, emergency escape rescue opening. Now they have dimensions for steps. The building codes typically said that you could have a well with a ladder. And now I guess this is kind of a modification so that now you can do steps, providing the steps meet these dimensions. And again, there's that 44 inches that's showing up. No, sorry. There's the 44 inches, only this time it says greater than 44 inches. You're required to have a ladder or steps. So if you're less than 44 inches, that tells me that you wouldn't need something like this because somebody should be able to, 44 inches, should be able to navigate up and over that without too many problems. So be careful with this because these dimensions for steps or stairs are different than what you're going to find in the egress section 310 of the code for every other area that's associated with stairs and steps. Okay. So this is not main egress. This is just emergency egress. All right, the slide, it's not showing up, but the slide I wanted to show you was EERO in existing buildings. It says that a 4 square foot clear opening for EERO is acceptable for basement remodel, basement addition, change of occupancy. And then it gives you some specific measurements about the height and the width and that square footage. You can't apply that to new construction, and I'm not so sure that this isn't going to get challenged because let's say I have an unfinished basement, and now the homeowner wants to come through and finish off that basement and make it put a bedroom down or a sleeping area down there. Currently, we require them to meet the other EERO requirements. This is now saying that in existing buildings, when you're doing remodel, you don't go to the section that requires either 5 square foot or 5.7 square foot. You're allowed to get by with 4 square foot. But again, that's kind of in conflict with that chapter 1 that says, as long as you leave that structure in its original existing condition, you never have to make it meet current code requirements. Which flip side of that says, if you change something, whatever you change now has to meet the current requirements, meaning an addition or an unfinished space that's completely finished off. Unfinished meaning it's wide open, no walls, no barriers. Now you come through and you finish it off, you make a rep room, you put a bathroom down there, you put a sleeping area, et cetera, et cetera. That's not existing. That's new construction. That's a change. Change of purpose, change of use. So this is this section that I'm talking about, and the slide doesn't show up. I don't know why, but that's kind of in conflict with chapter 1. So I have a feeling that might get challenged. And y'all are going to be the ones that are probably the ones that brings that to somebody's attention where that challenge starts.
Larry, what is that citation in paragraph 1?
What's that?
What is the citation in paragraph 1 that you're referring to?
You mean the section I'm talking about the no retrofit?
Larry, you can unmute your mic if you have to. We can hear you if you unmute, Larry. Yes, he's saying yes.
All right, so I don't have a copy of 2021 code yet. I've still got the 2018, but chapter 1, which is the administrative code, and I don't think this changed. (103.2). When applicable to construction. It's a paragraph about that long. And it says, starts off by saying, construction for which a permit application is submitted to the local building department on or after the effective date of the 2018 edition of the code shall comply with the provisions of this code. So that language is going to be duplicated in 2021. It's going to say, construction for when a permit application is submitted to the local building department on or after the effective date of the 2021 edition, then that has to meet this requirement. Then you go all the way down to the bottom and it says, in addition, when a permit has been properly issued under a previous edition of this code, meaning the 2021 edition, shall not require changes to the approved construction documents, design, or construction of such a building or structure, provided the permit has not been suspended or revoked. So that's the language I'm talking about when I'm talking about re-roofing, appliances, stuff like that. That verbiage that says, in addition, if building a structure was built under a previous edition of code, no changes have been made, CO hasn't been suspended or revoked, it never has to be brought up to meet the current code. We call that the no retrofit clause. I think it was 102.3. That's out of chapter 1. The reason why we call that the no retrofit clause is because there are some states, I don't know who they are, but I just know there are some states that require certain upgrades to homes when various new editions of the code come out. And imagine if we were under that rule, that every time something changed in the code, we would have to go in and mandatorily update our structure, our home, to meet that current code requirement. A good example would be the technology with ventilation, as well as with smoke detectors, CO detectors, breakers, arc fault breakers, GFCI breakers. In that instance, if that little piece of language wasn't in there, then the locality, wherever you live, could feasibly cause you to come back and upgrade your electrical to include smoke detectors in their locations, arc fault, GFCI. They could require you to upgrade your appliances, et cetera, et cetera.
Spring.
There is a slide about sprinklers. There is a change. It's a little bit of an addition. The gentleman in the back fully understand, I think, how the Virginia legislative process works and the lobbyist groups. And so over the years, there has been a huge push to have sprinklers put in single-family dwellings. They're in multifamily now, which is predominantly commercial. But there's been a huge push and it's been shot down, not only at the legislative level, but at the Board for Housing level as well. But you start to see stuff creep in a little bit of a time. And there is a slide that's now talking about sprinkler systems. I don't think it's still making it mandatory, but the requirements are, if you're going to do a sprinkler system, they're starting to increase. I suspect at some point, and it may not be a bad thing, because think about houses built in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. There wasn't all these man-made products, all this glue, resin, plastics. I think you've got a gentleman that this afternoon is going to talk to you about spray foam insulation. That stuff is highly flammable and it puts off a lot of toxic fumes and gases. I'm sure you've heard on the news about, I'm getting off track, so forgive me. You've heard on the news about how firefighters are having a lot of cancer issues now because of job-related hazards, right? Well, that's one of the reasons why they want to put sprinklers in buildings, is so they don't have to go in and knock those down. The sprinkler system, in essence, would knock it down. Then they're just kind of responding and not subjecting themselves to a highly flammable structure, all the smoke and gas and stuff. So sprinklers is one area that there are some changes, and they're small and incremental. Accessibility the same way. There's a slide in here about accessibility as well.
So Larry, when you introduced this thing earlier this morning, you talked about an online version. Could you talk about real quickly, just what is that? ICC safe?
There's a couple places you can go to. I generally tell people to go directly to the horse's mouth, which is ICC safe. The letter I, the letter C, the letter C, SAFE.org. And then you can just type in the search bar, Virginia Residential Code or Virginia Construction Code. And you can get an online read-only version. That's free. You can also go to a lot of the larger localities like Virginia Beach, Prince William, Arlington, Chesterfield, Henrico, and they may have a link on their website that takes you either to DHCD or takes you to ICCsafe.org. DHCD website has a link that takes you to ICC Safe. So that's why I say go directly to the horse's mouth. Just go to ICCsafe, one word, .org. And then when you get to their homepage, just type in Virginia Residential Code or Virginia Construction Code or whatever code you're looking for.
And they can get hard
Code.
copies there also?
Pardon me?
They can get hard copies there also?
Yes, you can buy hard copies there also. There's this ongoing push for everything to go digital. And I don't know how y'all conduct your inspections, but they've tried in Chesterfield County, they have tried several times to give us iPads or something like an iPad, and it doesn't really work for us. And there's a few legitimate reasons, few that I would consider, although I would complain about that, they're not necessarily legitimate, but there's a few legitimate reasons why that doesn't work for us. So what Chesterfield is doing, and I think a few of the other localities, is we have laptops. Those laptops stay hardwired to the vehicle. You go in, you do your inspection, you come back and you type all that information into the system, right? So there's a push for everything to go electronic, which means you don't have printed books anymore. And one of my complaints about that is, and this is on me, I'm a tactile learner. Somebody can sit there and talk to me like I'm talking to you all day long, and I'll retain or pick up on some of that. But you give me a book and you show it to me so I can physically see it and let that burn into my brain, I've got it. I'm good to go. So imagine trying to build a house or a shed by somebody telling you what the plans say rather than actually looking at the plans. That might be a better way to put that. I need those plans. I need that book. So the electronic version doesn't work, but there's a lot of people that prefer the electronic version.
So
In fact,
Tim-
on my laptop, I have what's called a premium subscription. So I've got access to all the codes electronically. But in the past, Chesterfield has put in their budget, they can order one book for each inspector of their discipline or their trade. Yes, sir.
Hi, sort of age-old question. Can you tell me, well, how do you define a sleeping area versus a finished room? Since all this applies to
All right.
sleeping areas.
Sleeping area used to be called a bedroom, and you heard me use bedroom. That's old language. It's now called a sleeping area. Under the old language, and maybe this is the best way to tie it all together. Under the old language, a bedroom had to meet a certain square footage, have a closet in it, and be used for sleeping purposes. Somewhere along the line, 2012, 2015, that got changed from bedroom to sleeping area. And the requirement about the closet went away. And it left it more up to the honor system about what the room was going to be used for. Inspectors, code enforcement inspectors see rooms all the time that are called flex rooms or bonus rooms. And you know daggone well that that's going to be used as a fourth or fifth bedroom. But because it's been declared as a flex room or a bonus room, there's nothing that we have the authority over to say, oh no, I think that's a sleeping area. So the code is kind of watered down sleeping area versus what used to be a bedroom. As far as finished and unfinished, we just had about a year-long debate in Chesterfield County about what is finished, what is unfinished. Because you won't find those terms in the building code. What you will find is conditioned versus unconditioned. So when you say finished versus unfinished, that's going to probably be left up to each locality. To me, in my mind, because I'm old school, unfinished means bare bones. You don't have any insulation, no wallboard, no anything. It's just wide open bare bones. Our director now says that, well, unfinished, as long as it doesn't have wallboard and it's not conditioned, you can still call that unfinished. So finished, unfinished, not in the code, and it's going to be left up to each locality. Sleeping room doesn't have to have a closet, but if they call it a sleeping room, then it has to meet all those requirements with EERO, smoke detector inside, smoke detector outside, et cetera, et cetera.
Simply say it's not a sleeping.
But if you're the architect and you call it something else, regardless of what the homeowner is going, or the owner is going to use that for, the code enforcement personnel have to go by what you declare it to be. Bonus room.
All right, so Tim Fisher, did you have a question? I see you have your hand up.
Yeah,
Tim
I have a
Fisher,
question about,
unmute.
you talked about, when you're replacing a roof specifically, you didn't have to meet current code requirements. What if the roofing manufacturer requires code requirements? Because when I had my roof replaced, the builder was actually able to argue with the insurance company, say the manufacturer requires it, not code. So they did put all those modern drip edge and ice guard on there.
That's a good question. Did everybody in the room hear that question? The manufacturer, the shingle manufacturer requires drip edge and requires ice and water shield and whatever else for their product, or they will void the warranty. The difference between home inspectors and code enforcement inspectors is y'all are a business. We're a regulatory authority. You can kind of do whatever you want. You can set your rules and regulations however you want. We can't. The reason why I mentioned chapter 1 is because what we do or don't do, we have to be given the authority to do. And chapter 1 is where that authority comes from. So chapter 1 tells us that because there's a no retrofit clause, regardless of what the shingle manufacturer is requiring, we can't enforce that. Because chapter 1 trumps anything that's in chapter 9 that says per manufacturer's installation instructions. So what I tell insurance companies, contractors, and homeowners, That's a civil matter between you, your contractor, and your insurance company. And you have to work it out that way. We've gone blank down here, if that matters. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but in general, I think builders do have to follow manufacturer's instructions as well. And sometimes those are much more specific than what you find in code, but I understand. Thank you.
Any other questions about that? That no retrofit thing can be a hassle and can be a headache. But the reason why I gave you the example of home inspectors and contractors of businesses and code enforcement personnel are a regulatory authority, just like the police. We can't just go out and say, oh, well, the manufacturer requires it, you got to put it in. Because if there's a regulation that says we don't have the authority to require that, then we're outside the scope of our authority. John, I may run into your time. All right, so stairways and ramps. Scoping language has been added to this section to clarify that the associated elements that are within an attached or to a building, porch, or deck are required to be per the sections 311.7, 311.8. This is kind of what I was referring to about buildings and structures. See where it says attached. So if it's attached to a building or structure, then the code pulls that in. If it's out in the yard, it's not. It's not considered building or structure. It can be considered landscaping. So the requirements for stairs and ramps, et cetera, out in the yard, that's landscaping, doesn't have to meet this section. And then there are a few exceptions about non-habitable attics, which is where you get your pull down, you can get your pull down, and then crawl spaces. This is a new exception that allows steeper slopes for exterior landings that serve to drain surface water away from the building. Previously, the landing that's required at the bottom of the steps at the grade could be level. Now it's going to require a minimum of 2% slope so that water runs away. And back to that comment that I just made about buildings and structures, typically, this is where the scope of the building code and the code enforcement personnel's authority stops, right there. Window fall
Tim, you got your
protection.
hand up again.
What's that?
Tim Fisher's got his hand up again.
I apologize. I thought it was lowered.
All right, window fall protection. Early on, I mentioned that less than or equal to 44 or greater than 44. So when John calls me and I need more specific information, this is what I'm talking about. Where's the window located? What's the distance from the opening to grade? So I'll know which section for it to apply to. As you can see in this particular slide, in this particular instance, there are a couple of criteria. Greater than or equal to 24 inches from the finished floor to the bottom of the opening, and then greater than 6 foot from the bottom of the opening to grade. Smoke alarm locations. This is an addition under the 2018 code. If it were a sleeping area, well, this says bedroom, but if it was a sleeping area, then you would have to have a smoke detector inside that bedroom and outside adjacent. This section is now stating that, but if you have a hallway of some sort, and then you've got a larger opening that's greater than or equal to 24 inches for the room adjacent to that little hallway, you now have to add a smoke detector at the highest point of that ceiling. So the way that would read is you need a smoke detector in the bedroom you need a smoke detector outside that bedroom, parentheses door, and you need a smoke detector at the highest point of the ceiling of the great room. Smoke alarms near cooking compliances. This is just kind of a, change in the language. I'm kind of surprised to see this because the code has, over the cycles, gotten away from having requirements about smoke detectors and appliances, and it just says per manufacturer's installation instructions. So now they've got a specific requirement about now permitted to be as close to 6 feet from the cooking appliance. So let's say you go out to do your new residential inspection and John goes out to do his inspection. I've come along and I've approved that because of this, but I didn't have access to the smoke detector installation instructions. John does, and John puts a note on his report that smoke detectors manufacturer instructions say that it can't be within 6 feet. If John wants to call me and I'll have a conversation with the builder, if not, then that's something that could be handled between the buyer and the contractor. But again, typically, if there's a conflict between chapter 1 and the code, then usually the most strict or stringent requirements take effect. In this case, if the manufacturer specs say that you can't be within 6 feet and the code says, yes, you can, then I would probably tell the contractor, well, John's right. The data from the smoke detector manufacturer says you can't comply with that. Oh, the other thing I've noticed, the wrong way. Other thing I've noticed is you now have photoelectric and ionized. That is probably why this is being put in there. But how do you tell what type of smoke detector you have? You have to disengage it and look on the back side, don't you? And I can tell you 9 times out of 10, when I go into a home, there's not a ladder there for me to get up there and take that down. So there's some guesswork, there's some assumption on our part. Fortunately for the combos, the CO smoke, they now have a label right on the face. I can shine my light up there and I can look at it and I can verify that. But for photoelectric and ionization, that's typically labeled on the backside, which is covered up.
So Larry, you got your hand up?
Yes, real quickly. A couple slides back, you showed a picture of the 72 inches down to grade, and your grade was a radically steep drop. Do you have to measure 36 inches out there to get your 72 inches, or are you going right to where that grade starts?
In this particular instance, it's going to be measured just like what the diagram shows, in a pretty much close vertical line. If you're talking,
you don't measure it like you would a deck, falling off a deck.
yes,
Okay.
that this particular section doesn't give you stipulations like it does for the guardrails when it's talking about an elevated, and the guardrail requirement, if you remember, if you recall, clearly now says that you have to have a 36-inch minimum kind of flat landing out away from this area. That requirement is not here for an EERO.
Thank you.
Protection of wood against decay. This was clarified. The notes say that this particular section has not changed significantly over many code cycles. This update accomplishes a much needed overhaul. And it's to clarify the requirements, clean up some errors in syntax and correct some spelling and misleading text. So there's some areas, sections that have been deleted. I've got a diagram in my notes. I don't know why the diagram's not showing up, but Accessibility. This is one of the slides I was referring to earlier when I was talking about sprinklers. R320 accessibility clarifies that accessibility provisions for live-work units and owner-occupied lodging houses, otherwise bed and breakfasts, now have some accessibility requirements. The notes say that generally VRC buildings, residential buildings do not require accessibility, and accessible features are optional. I wanted to point out that accessibility is different than the interior passage requirements found in section R332. So when you're talking accessibility, it's ADA, handicap, full-blown kind of stuff. That's the definition of accessibility. Federal code stuff. ANSI, stuff like that. Interior passage is something different, so don't confuse the two. You know what I'm talking about when I say interior passage? There's a section in the same chapter, chapter 3, that says that if you got a bathroom located on first floor, then you have to have a minimum 210 door to get into that bathroom. That's not accessibility, that's interior passage requirements. It's kind of leaning that way. So you remember I said a moment ago about sprinklers have been kind of slowly creeping stuff in, so is accessibility. There's been a huge lobbyist every cycle to get some full-blown ANSI stuff, accessibility stuff into the residential code. By the way, I mentioned ADAG. ADAG is a federal standard. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we don't enforce the federal standard. We enforce ANSI. The federal standard only deals with people that are handicapped. They're missing arms, legs, blind, or whatever. The ANSI standard takes that a step further and broadens that out to be children and those of us that are weekend warriors and get temporarily injured, or our parents, older folks. So that's the difference between ADAG, the federal standard, and ANSI. So in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we don't enforce ADAG or the federal standard, we enforce ANSI. This is the new section, storm shelters. Storm shelters have been added through multiple studies and analysis. Residential storm shelters have failed because typically somebody builds it, they say it's a storm shelter, but it wasn't built to the standard. Now, if you build a storm shelter and you call it a storm shelter, it's going to have to meet this standard, this ICC 500 standard. So if you build something and you don't call it a storm shelter, then you're okay, but you can't call it a storm shelter. But if you're going to dig a hole in your backyard with the intent of having a safe space to go to and you call it a storm shelter, it's going to have to meet the standard. And that's now in the code. Photovoltaic, I left that in. I don't know, do y'all get involved in photovoltaic, solar panels, stuff like that on the roof?
Not yet, but we will be.
Then you might want to follow this section because there's a lot of changes coming down the pike about this. There are some changes in this current code that wasn't in the previous code about fire department access that reduces some of the clearances. But with the advent of more and more people wanting to go green or get off the grid or whatever it is they're trying to accomplish, this section is becoming bigger and bigger. So keep an, if you're going to get involved in this, keep an eye on this section. Because there's some significant changes happening. Foundations, footing width and thicknesses have changed. A review of underlying calculations found minimum widths and thickness where loads assumed were incorrect. Therefore, the table has been changed. That's the table. Keep in mind that this is for houses, additions, It's not for decks. There's a change in the table for decks too. We'll get to that shortly. Foundation waterproofing. There have been some deletions here. In the approved products column, 6 mil poly and polyethylene products have not proven to possess the thickness or strength to be effective and durable, so they were deleted. Chapter 5, floors. Vapor retarders under concrete slabs, the minimum thickness has gone from 6 mil to 10 mil. Be careful of the requirements in the code because there are locations that are exempt from this. For example, garages to include attached garages. It's not required to have this. Utility buildings and other unheated accessory structures. Most builders will put that poly down for an attached garage, but because it's an unheated surface, it's not required. Here's the deck footing requirement. In my notes, it says that there are 2 exceptions. Exception 1, joists supported on grade do not require footings. Most localities, I think, would consider that a patio. So we've just kind of let that go. You don't even need a permit. So you build a wooden deck right on grade. Now, the code says, okay, we recognize some are going to do that, no footing required. Exception number 2 says a small deck low to the ground may use concrete piers as footings directly supported the joist on grade. I think that's going to cause a lot of problems because what's the definition of a small deck low to the ground? I bet if you polled everybody that's listening to this, you'd probably get however many people in this room and then the 39 people that are joining us by online. You'd probably get that many
42,
opinions.
42,
42?
42.
Yeah, that's how many opinions you'd get about what a small deck low to the ground is. So I think that's going to be a problem. So when you encounter that under the 2021 code, I would encourage you to contact your local, whatever the local building inspections office is, and say, what is your definition? And then let that drive how you look at that. Here's the table that's been revised. I looked at that and then I looked at it again and then I slept on it and I looked at it again. And I'm like, how many contractors are going to be able to calculate that? Because you got to take in the ground or snow load, you got to take in the tributary area. And now you've got to know what your soil bearing is. And then you come up with, in that table, you come up with the size of your footer. How many know what tributary area is and how to calculate that? Yeah. The definition of tributary area, square feet, which is different than the definition of tributary area, is you take the measurement halfway from one support to the other, and then you multiply that by the width. And that's your tributary area by square feet. So that's why I say I think this table is going to cause some problems. Because I have problems calculating that. How's a contractor going to calculate that? Deck posts, there's a deck post height now. And in my notes, I've got the American Wood Council, or AWC, has a 40-page document titled Prescriptive Residential Wood Deck Construction Guide. And that's what a lot of this stuff that's being put into Chapter 5 of Section 507 is based upon. If you want to know everything there is to know about how to build a deck, then that 40-page document is available online. It's free. And might give you a better understanding of a lot of these requirements.
To understand the prior thing, if you had your small low to the ground deck, whatever that is, you don't need to have a proper footer pier. You can just buy some piece of concrete and plop it on the ground.
Yes, that's what this is telling you.
It's amazing.
Well, that's a good point that back to chapter 1 and the regulatory authority. We, inspection staff, boots on ground, don't write the code. We're required to enforce it. And there's a few things that have come along in my 30 years that I have not agreed with. And I've been told point blank by my supervisors and my boss, I don't care whether you agree with it or not, it's in the code, you will enforce it. Or it's not in the code, so you can enforce it. So. Yeah, yeah. I should have brought along a copy of the cable code that was in effect when I first went with the county in 1992-ish. It's about that thick. And oh, by the way, it's only like this. Well, look at this code book. I don't know how many times that cable code, this is times the cable code. There's a lot going on in that book, a lot that us and y'all have to be responsible for if you're going to do new residential structure inspections, right? And then when you got 116 new requirements from one code addition to the other, it's getting to the point where it's unmanageable, I think. So, which is another reason why I decided to hang it up. All right, moving along, exterior guards. There are now requirements for guardrails in chapter 507, which is where you find the deck stuff, rather than referring you back to chapter 3, where there's guards and handrail requirements. It's now been pulled forward and it's actually in chapter 507. Again, if you go out to the American Wood Council and you find that document, that's a pretty informative document. And the American Wood Council is pretty good about putting stuff out there in a PDF form that's free, unlike the standards. If you see a standard like ICC 500, you know right off the bat, you're gonna have to pay for that. ASTM 1346, you're gonna have to pay for that. But this stuff, the prescriptive guides and some other stuff that American Wood Council puts out, that's free. Can give you a lot of good resource, good knowledge base. Wall construction. There's some changes to the table for fasteners, for roof and wall. This particular table addresses wall. This particular table addresses roof sheathing. There's a change to the cripple wall requirements. Cripple wall requirements only apply to exterior cripple walls here. And the notes say that the requirement for continuous sheathing on cripple wall studs with a height less than 14 inches is intended to ensure the integrity of the studs when nails are nailed into studs by face nailing through the top and bottom plates. I'm assuming that the reason why they now want that is because of racking, lateral movement. Stiffen up that wall so that doesn't happen. Wall coverings. This says I'm halfway through. I'm supposed to wrap this up at 9:45, right?
You have 20 minutes.
All right, let's see what we can do. Vapor retarders. It's been reorganized to clarify and ease of use. The one thing I want to point out is, for the most part, we're in region 4. I've got a slide coming up that shows that there have been additional regions added to Virginia, but vapor retarders are not required in the Commonwealth of Virginia for the most part in region 4. And the purpose for that is, the reason for a vapor retarder, it's supposed to go on the warm side so that it prevents moisture from moving through, right? And meeting up with the cold air. Well, in this area, region 4, we pretty much have equal heating and cooling days, meaning half the year you got the air conditioner on, the other half you got the furnace on. So there's really no need in a vapor retarder, because if you're going to go by the logic of it has to be on the warm side, half the year it need to be on the inside, the other half of the year needs to be on the outside. Yes.
So that's Tyvek paper?
Nope, tieback is an air barrier.
So you're saying tar paper? As-
Tar paper, plastic, roll-on membrane, anything that will not, that's moisture impermeable. It won't let moisture through. The problem, a lot of contractors try to use Tyvek as part of their flatching, but Tyvek lets water through. I've never understood how it can let water through, but it won't let air through. But and then on a personal note, we require them to put Tyvek or house wrap. Tyvek is like Xerox. It's a proprietary word. We require them to put house wrap. Then we allow them to put all these massive staples and fasteners. So what good is the air barrier doing, right? What's that?
Tyvek says you have to tape them.
Yeah, well, how many people are going to tape all those fasteners, right? You can hardly get them to tape the seams.
You're also not allowed to staple it anymore. You have to use one of those cap nails.
Again, per manufacturer's installation instructions. This is just a slide that describes what class 1, class 2, and class 3 is. Tie attachment and airspace. There's a slide coming up that would probably better explain this. You're probably not going to see this in residential construction, primarily commercial construction, because the reason for this change is to increase this gap behind the airspace between the veneer and the substrate or the sheathing, so that you can install insulation, so that you can get your R value requirements and have it on the exterior of the building, not on the interior. And so if you notice, there's a couple other changes that are on this diagram. Nobody in the residential world uses this. That is a commercial product. And then how many contractors are going to have the forethought to increase their projection on their footing to include all this additional, right? So I don't think you're going to see this residentially unless you've got a high-end builder or unless you're in an area that is trying to obtain some sort of green energy requirement. And the only way they can do that is by putting foam board on the exterior. Soffits, requirements for soffits have gotten more stringent. There's a new section, and here's the overview of that. This has been generated because of the study in the high wind areas about as long as the building stays intact, it will resist the wind and the forces. But as soon as you start to remove cladding and allow wind in that building, you're starting to cause a problem. So in the notes, it says in the study, there's been a lot of soffits that have blown out, which allowed wind to get in, and then the building just kind of implodes or explodes. So here's an example of what's required now.
All right, so Larry, you got your hand up.
Yeah, so are you saying that, say, a porch roof that has vinyl, a vinyl roof, vinyl soffit, it has to have solid sheathing? You can't just, when you're up in the attic, you can't see that white glowing, just plain vinyl, and there has to be solid sheathing there.
No, that's not what this says. What this is telling you is that you can't just put a piece of C or F channel up and pop your siding in and let it just kind of float freely. That siding has to be secured, or that soffit has to be secured now. And the only way you can do that is by adding nailer strips, depending on the unsupported span per that section, which probably is based upon manufacturers.
And so the nailing strips are going to hold that entire vinyl soffit in place during a hurricane. In other words,
That's the intent, yes.
so
Yeah,
there's no
whether that
requirement.
works in real life or not, I don't know. But that's the intent.
Okay. Thank you.
Think about it this way. You've got a truss roof. Trusses are 24 inches on center. So when you put your J channel up there, either at your intersection with your wall or out at your fascia board, you're only nailing that piece of J channel, or in this particular diagram, there's no J channel even there. They're using their cladding for their fascia board as a way to terminate and set that soffit in. So that soffit is not attached to anything. And in most instances, the soffit, it comes in 12-foot sheets, but you generally cut it in widths of whatever your soffit is, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got trusses that are 24 inches on center, then you've got every other piece of soffit that may have one nail in it. So what they're telling you now is that depending upon the span, if it's on, let's say using 12 inches, if unsupported span is 12 inches, then you're required to put a nailer back at where the intersection of the wall is. And then you don't require a nailer out here. You can still use your coil stock or whatever, but your J channel is going to have to be nailed into your nailer, whatever that requirement is. Back over here, if it exceeds 12 inches using that same, then you're going to have to put a nailer at the intersection of the wall and a midterm nailer so that you can attach your siding to that nailer. Every piece of siding would have to be attached. And I guess the thinking or the logic is that when the wind comes along, now that that siding is more secure, it won't blow out, which won't allow wind in the home or won't allow the pressures to change. Because typically that's what happens is the pressure changes. Unless you get a direct wind load, the pressure change is more of a hazard than the actual wind load. But once you've opened that home up and you've subjected it to the 70 or 80 mile an hour winds, now you've got a problem where you've got to keep that fastened, attached diaphragmatically so that it doesn't lift off and blow away. So this is just a precursor to that is let's keep the wind out, just like let's keep the water out and hope that that works so that, or at least minimizes the damage that could occur while the storm is passing through. Here's a chart that tells you what those minimum spans are. Roof and roof covering. So as I just mentioned, there have been some changes to the heel joint connection, both in a positive and what I think is a negative way. It's actually reduced some of the nailing, but in other areas, it's increased the requirements. And that is when you start at the foundation, your foundation is attached to your footer, your building is attached to your foundation, the floor is attached to the foundation, your walls are attached to the floor, the roof or the second, third stories are attached to the walls, and then the roof is attached, and it becomes a diaphragm. Meaning if you push on one side, the whole thing is supposed to act together and distribute that load. The representation that was given about the Francis Key Scott Bridge was people are questioning, why did that whole 1.5 mile span drop? Because in an engineering perspective, you hit one pylon, yeah, it should have distributed the load, but the whole thing shouldn't have collapsed. So I'm hoping the investigation will give some additional information, because that's the purpose of all of this stuff, especially in buildings and structures, is you create a diaphragm, meaning it becomes one piece. And when you affect one portion of it, the rest of it is supposed to act in accordance with whatever those shifting loads are, support that so that it doesn't fail. And so back to the cripple wall thing, I think that's part of why they now want sheathing on the cripple walls, is so that when you get that, I think it's leeward wind, when the wind is pushing against it, it doesn't want to rack. It wants to support, stay rigid, and stay in a diaphragmatic manner. This is the revised table for the heel joint connections. Energy. over the cycles, there's been more and more energy stuff that's come into play. That this is one. You heard me mention a moment ago, Region 4. So all of Virginia used to be in Region 4 or Area Climate Zone 4. Now, Virginia has 3 zones. 19 counties were moved to 3A and 5 counties were moved to 5A. The rest of them stayed in 4 or 4A. Here are those counties, and here's the designation. 3A warm is the brown, so that's these southeastern counties, which I believe is going to include York, which is where we are, right? You've got 5A cool humid, which is in the mountains, this area, right along the West Virginia border. And then the rest of the state is stayed the same, stayed in 4. So in Region 4, a vapor retarder is not required, which is why you will see unfaced insulation in a wall or in a ceiling. You'll also see faced insulation, but it's not required in Region 4. And that's the reason, because Region 4 is designated to have equal heating and cooling days. So if you want to follow the scientific logic, half of the year you need a vapor retarder on the inside, the other half of the year you need it on the outside. Seven minutes. All right, so the other thing that's come in, and I don't know that you're going to see this, but for the longest time, the residential code has been prescriptive. And the way that was explained to me was it's kind of like a cookbook. So if you take a cookbook and you start off with all these raw ingredients, by the end of the recipe, you've got this nice, delicious, whatever you've baked or cooked, right? That's prescriptive. The commercial code, on the other hand, has always been predominantly performance, meaning the architect or the engineer determines how he wants or she wants that building built and how it's supposed to perform. So you can get a bunch of trade-offs. You can't do that in residential construction. This is going to probably allow contractors to start moving towards the performance, meaning they don't want to put R60 in the ceiling. They want to do R40 or 38, and then they want to ramp up the requirements somewhere else to compensate for that. That's performance. The problem with this is that you have to have, to simplify it, you have to have an energy assessment done, and that can't be done by me. That can't be done by you. It has to be done by a certified energy analyst, certified through the Commonwealth of Virginia. And they have to come in and they have to fill out a report, not this one. This is part of it, but this energy efficiency certificate is in addition to what's required for what you would normally see in the attic. The purpose of this is purpose of that is so that when the homeowner down the road wants to do some renovations, they have access to what the components were installed when the home was originally built. There's a change here where we're now going to talk more about U factor versus R value. That's going to be a little bit confusing because U factor is a scientific approach, whereas R value is just a number. U factor is thermal resistance, which equates to heat transmission through a building component based upon a time rate per unit, whereas R value is the inverse of U factor, and it's a key of resistance. So when you look at insulation and it says R15, the resistance value is 15. And that's fairly simple. U factors 0.35 or 0.35. You have to calculate some of that. And I don't know how to do that. And I'm certified to do energy stuff, energy inspections as well as energy review. And part of that is if you don't use it, you lose it. But the other part is a lot of this energy stuff is designed and put in there by engineers. I am not an engineer, and I don't think like an engineer. Single insulation, the purpose of this slide is to bring to your attention that we're going from 49 to 60. And the 2018 code said that when it went from 38 to 49, said that the insulation now has to go over the top plate without being compressed. So basically, you've got a continuous pathway from your thermal envelope in your wall into your either rafter cavity if you're doing a slope ceiling or into your flat ceiling. Now they're going to 60. 49, here we are 3 years later. You talk to Quality Products or Lehman Brothers, they'll tell you they order 3 truckloads of 49, they might get a half a load. I don't even know if the industry is making 60. So I don't understand why in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we would go with something R60 when you can't even get 49. But two things there, the 2021 code goes up to R60 in the ceiling. And it still has to go over the top plate without being compressed. So R49 is 15, 16 inches, not compressed. So what's 60 going to be? So what's that going to do to the framing of the soffit area? My mind doesn't make sense, right? Few minutes. I might be able to make it out of this in 2 minutes. Floor insulation, there's 3 methods of compliance now. Previously, the insulation had to be in contact with whatever the wallboard or whatever the flooring was. Now you're allowed 3 different ways to accomplish that. And then an unconditioned basement, you heard me mention earlier, there's nothing in the code that talks about finished versus unfinished, but there is requirements and definitions to talk about conditioned and unconditioned. So if you have an unconditioned basement, meaning there's no HVAC, there's no conditioning of the air, not heated, not cooled, or either, then this is now how you have to insulate the basement. Air sealed electrical boxes, this is a new requirement. Not only do the boxes have to meet a standard, but they're going to have to be installed properly and be sealed so you don't have the air moving around. Back to that floor insulation, there's some requirements in duct insulation that incorporate that. So that now if your duct insulation is in your floor system and it's completely within the thermal envelope, it doesn't have to be insulated to all those R values that are in the mechanical code. Mechanical ventilation now requires testing, which means I think balancing and stuff like that. Lighting equipment, high efficacy lighting is now required in all permanent lighting fixtures. It used to be a percentage of bulbs had to be high efficacy, and now everything has to be that way. Interior lighting controls. These slides we're going through now is another reason why I think contractors are going to request the 2018, not the 2021. This stuff is expensive, very expensive. So interior lighting controls are required now, so that when you walk into a room, you've got an occupant sensor there, the lights go on, lights go off. You don't have to flip the switch anymore. There are some exceptions. Exterior lighting controls are incorporated into that with some exceptions. You see a lot of this, it's already in commercial buildings. In fact, it might even be in here, where you walk in, the lights come on, and then after a certain period of time, when there's no movement, the lights go out. Here's that simulated performance. They just changed the name to total building performance. You can't just do trade-offs. You still have to do some of the prescriptive, but then you have to do some of the other stuff, which doesn't just include the thermal envelope. It'll also include mechanical equipment. You may have to upsize your mechanical equipment. You may, depending on the location of your ductwork, they may have to be insulated in a different manner, more of an R value. And then you and I, unless we're a certified energy analyst, we can't verify and submit the report that's required for that. It has to be done by certified energy analysis. There's the requirements for total building performance. It's a long laundry list. See where it says mechanical and electrical. So it's not just the insulation or the air barrier, the vapor retarder. It draws in your components and your equipment as well. And that gets to be very expensive. All right, I think my time is up, which means we're not going to get to the mechanical, plumbing, and electrical. So sorry about that.
Thank you, Larry.